Welcome to the warm, cozy blanket channel. Today, I'm going to tell you a story in the genre of psychological thriller, in which there is a place for shame, guilt, redemption, and acceptance. Subscribe to my channel to keep up to date with the latest news. Put a like under this video if you liked it. Now, make yourselves comfortable. I'm going to start my story. The Memory Haunt. Part 1, The First Whisper. Dr. James Cross had always prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize. His mind was a fortress, each memory neatly filed away in its designated chamber, locked behind impenetrable steel doors. Or so he thought. It began with a whisper. At first, it was faint, so subtle that James dismissed it as the hum of the city outside his window, or the creak of old floorboards settling into the night. But then it came again, clearer this time, cutting through the silence like a blade. A voice, not his own. James. He froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard of his laptop. The room was dark except for the soft glow of his desk lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. His wife, Sarah, lay asleep in the bed behind him, her breathing steady and rhythmic. He turned slowly, scanning the room. Nothing. Just the familiar contours of their bedroom, the dresser, the armchair by the window, the stack of medical journals piled haphazardly on the nightstand. "You're imagining things," he muttered under his breath, forcing himself to return to the article he'd been reading. Sleep deprivation, he told himself. Too many late nights at the lab. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. 2 days later, the voice returned. This time, it wasn't just a name, it was a sentence, spoken with chilling clarity. "I trusted you." James nearly dropped the coffee mug he'd been holding. The words reverberated in his skull, echoing as if they'd been shouted from the other end of a cathedral. He spun around, heart pounding, but the kitchen was empty. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds, painting golden stripes across the counter. Everything was normal. And yet, he gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles white, trying to steady his breathing. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound calm. There was no response, only the distant chirping of birds outside and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Sarah walked in moments later, yawning and tying her robe around her waist. "Morning," she said brightly, reaching for the kettle. "You look like you've seen a ghost." James forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Just tired, I guess." She raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. They both knew he'd been working too hard lately. Between his research at the lab and the endless stream of patients seeking treatment for PTSD, he rarely had time to breathe, let alone sleep. Still, something about her casual dismissal rankled him. If only she knew what he'd heard, if only he could explain it without sounding insane. That evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, James sat alone in his study, staring at the blank screen of his computer. The house was silent now, save for the occasional groan of the pipes. He told himself he should go to bed, try to get some rest, but his mind refused to quiet. Instead, it churned with questions, doubts, fears. And then it happened again. This time, the voice belonged to someone he recognized immediately. It was Daniel Harper, one of his former patients, a young man who had come to him struggling with severe depression and anxiety following a traumatic car accident. Daniel had seemed to be improving during their sessions, but 6 months ago, he had taken his own life. James still remembered the weight of the phone call from Daniel's mother, the way her voice had broken when she said, "I thought he was getting better." Now Daniel's voice filled the room, clear and accusing. "Why didn't you help me?" James bolted upright, knocking over his chair in the process. His pulse roared in his ears as he scanned the darkness, searching for the source of the sound. But there was nothing. No one. Just the oppressive silence pressing down on him like a physical weight. "Daniel," he whispered hoarsely, half hopping for a response, half dreading it. When none came, he sank back into his seat, trembling. For the first time in years, tears pricked at the corners of his eyes. By the end of the week, the voices had become a constant presence. They weren't always loud or distinct. Sometimes they were little more than murmurs, fragments of conversations he couldn't quite make out. Other times, they were sharp and piercing, demanding his attention. Each one seemed to belong to someone from his past, a patient, a colleague, even his mother, whose death he still hadn't fully processed. Desperate for answers, James reached out to his oldest friend, Dr. Mark Flynn, a psychiatrist who specialized in dissociative disorders. They met at a small cafe near Mark's office, the kind of place where no one would overhear their conversation. "You're sure these voices aren't just stress-induced hallucinations?" Mark asked after James finished recounting his experiences. He leaned forward, his expression serious but not dismissive. "I'm not hallucinating," James insisted, his voice low but firm. "These voices, they're real. They know things, details I haven't thought about in years." Mark frowned, tapping his pen against the table. "There's something else you should consider," he said finally. "Your lab has been experimenting with neural implants, right? The ones designed to enhance memory recall." James nodded, unsure where this was going. What if someone or something is using that technology against you? The implications of Mark's words hit James like a freight train. He had always assumed his work was safe, ethical. But what if he was wrong? What if the very tools he had helped develop were now being used to unravel his mind? As he left the cafe, the whispers started again, louder this time, overlapping in a cacophony of accusations and pleas. James quickened his pace, his chest tightening with every step. By the time he reached his car, he was gasping for air, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unlock the door. For the first time in his life, James Cross felt truly afraid, not of what lurked in the shadows, but of what might be lurking within himself. James drove home in a daze, the voices swirling around him like a storm. They were louder now, more insistent, each one vying for his attention. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, as if holding on could anchor him to reality. But reality itself felt slippery, like sand slipping through his fingers. "Why did you let me die?" One voice hissed, a woman's voice this time. It was softer than Daniel, tinged with sadness rather than anger. "Who are you?" James whispered aloud, glancing at the rearview mirror, as though expecting someone to appear in the back seat. The road behind him was empty, bathed in the orange glow of streetlights. "You know who I am," the voice replied, almost gently. "You just don't want to remember." A chill ran down his spine. That voice, it sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. Not yet. His mind raced, trying to match it to a face, a name, anything. But all he could see were flashes, fragments of memories that refused to coalesce into something coherent. The car swerved slightly as his focus wavered. He jerked the wheel back into place, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool night air streaming through the cracked window. He needed to pull over, to stop and breathe, but the thought of sitting still while those voices surrounded him was unbearable. Instead, he pressed harder on the accelerator, hoping speed would drown them out. It didn't work. If anything, they grew louder, more chaotic, until it felt like his skull might split open from the pressure. By the time he reached his neighborhood, James was barely functioning. His vision blurred, his hands trembled uncontrollably, and the voices had merged into a deafening roar. He barely registered turning onto his street, barely noticed the red light ahead until it was too late. Brakes screeched as he slammed them down, but the car skidded across the wet pavement. Time slowed to a crawl as the world tilted sideways. Metal crunched against metal as his vehicle collided with another car at the intersection. The impact threw him forward, the seatbelt digging painfully into his chest. For a moment, there was silence, blessed, absolute silence. Then came the ringing in his ears, the distant sound of someone shouting, the acrid smell of smoke and burnt rubber filling the air. James blinked, disoriented, his head pounding. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, dripping onto his shirt. Through the shattered windshield, he saw people running toward him, their faces pale with shock. Someone was calling 911. Another person was banging on his window, yelling something he couldn't understand. But none of that mattered, because in the chaos, amidst the wreckage and the screams, the voices had stopped. For the first time in days, his mind was quiet. Hours later, James found himself lying in a hospital bed, staring up at the fluorescent lights above him. A nurse bustled around the room, checking monitors and adjusting IV drips, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by what had happened, or rather, what hadn't happened since the crash. No voices, no whispers, just silence. Sarah sat beside him, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She held his hand tightly, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. "James, you need to tell me what's going on," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't just stress or exhaustion. Something's wrong." He wanted to tell her. God, how he wanted to explain everything, the voices, the fear, the feeling that his own mind was betraying him. But how could he? How could he make her understand without sounding like he'd lost his grip on reality? "I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what's happening to me." She squeezed his hand, tears spilling down her cheeks. "We'll figure it out together, okay? Whatever it is, we'll get through it." Her words should have comforted him, but instead, they filled him with dread. What if he couldn't get through it? What if the voices came back, and next time, they didn't stop? The next morning, a police officer arrived to take his statement about the accident. James recounted the events as best he could, leaving out any mention of the voices. As far as the authorities were concerned, it was a simple case of distracted driving. The other driver had walked away with minor injuries, thankfully. But James knew he was lucky to be alive. When the officer left, Mark appeared in the doorway, looking grim. He pulled up a chair and leaned in close, lowering his voice. "I did some digging last night," he said, "about your lab's neural implant project." James stiffened, his stomach twisting into knots. "What did you find?" Mark hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to continue. Finally, he sighed. The project wasn't just about enhancing memory recall. There was a secondary objective, something classified. It involved using the implants to access suppressed memories. Memories the subject might not even realize they had. James stared at him, his blood running cold. Suppressed memories. Mark nodded. "Think about it, James. What if these voices aren't hallucinations? What if they're fragments of things you've buried deep inside yourself? Things you don't want to remember." The implications hit him like a punch to the gut. Buried memories. Guilt. Secrets. Was that why the voices sounded so real, so personal? Because they weren't coming from outside, they were coming from within. "And there's more," Mark added reluctantly. "The project was shut down 2 years ago after several test subjects experienced severe psychological breakdowns. Some of them never recovered." James closed his eyes, the weight of Mark's words pressing down on him. If what he said was true, then he wasn't just hearing voices, he was unraveling. Piece by piece, his carefully constructed life was falling apart, revealing the dark truths he'd spent years trying to hide. That night, as Sarah slept in the chair beside him, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The silence was oppressive now, a stark contrast to the cacophony of voices that had plagued him before the accident. Part of him hoped they wouldn't return, but another part, the darker, more fearful part, knew they would, because deep down, he understood what Mark had been hinting at. The voices weren't random. They weren't meaningless. They They were echoes of his past, reminders of mistakes he'd made, people he'd hurt, choices he wished he could undo. And sooner or later, they would force him to confront the truth. As sleep finally claimed him, a single thought lingered in his mind, repeating itself like a mantra. Sometimes, the ghosts we run from are our own. Part 2, The Echoes of the Past. When James woke up in the hospital the next morning, the silence was still there. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to hope that the accident had somehow reset his mind, silenced the voices for good. But as he swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, a wave of dizziness washed over him, and with it came the first whisper. "Welcome back." It was soft, almost playful, but it sent a jolt of fear through his body. He froze, gripping the edge of the bed to steady himself. The voice wasn't angry this time, just present, observant, as if it had been waiting for him to wake up. James closed his eyes, willing it to go away. "Leave me alone," he muttered under his breath. "Oh, we're not going anywhere," the voice replied, its tone shifting to something colder, more menacing. "Not until you face what you've done." His knees buckled, and he sank back onto the bed. The room spun around him, the sterile white walls blurring into a haze. He wanted to scream, to call for help, but what would he say? That voices in his head were accusing him of crimes he couldn't remember committing. They'd lock him up in a psych ward before he could finish the sentence. Instead, he forced himself to breathe, counting slowly to 10. When he opened his eyes again, the dizziness had subsided, and the voice was gone for now. But he knew it wasn't over. Whatever had started, it was only getting worse. By the time he was discharged from the hospital 2 days later, James had convinced himself that the voices were a symptom of stress and trauma. The accident had shaken him, yes, but surely that was all it was. He returned home determined to get back to normal, to bury himself in work, to focus on anything but the whispers that lingered at the edges of his consciousness. But normalcy proved elusive. The first night back, as he lay in bed beside Sarah, the voices returned with a vengeance. This time, they weren't fragmented or disjointed, they formed a chorus, each one speaking over the others in a chaotic symphony of accusation and despair. "You let her die. Why didn't you save me? It's your fault." He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block them out, but it was useless. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside his head, echoing in the deepest recesses of his mind. Tears streamed down his face as he curled into a ball, shaking uncontrollably. Sarah stirred beside him, reaching out to touch his shoulder. "James, are you okay?" He nodded, though he knew she couldn't see him in the dark. "Just bad dreams," he lied. His voice cracked, betraying the lie even as he spoke it. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. I promise." Her words should have comforted him, but instead, they filled him with guilt. How could he ask her to help when he didn't even know what was wrong with him? the truth might destroy everything they had. The next day, James decided to take Mark's advice and dig deeper into the neural implant project. If the voices were connected to suppressed memories, then perhaps uncovering those memories would silence them once and for all. Or so he hoped. He started by reviewing old research files from the lab, poring over data and notes late into the night. At first, it seemed like a dead end, just technical jargon and clinical observations. But then he stumbled upon something unexpected, a list of names. Former test subjects who had participated in the classified phase of the project. One name jumped out at him immediately: Emily Carter. Emily, the name triggered something in his mind, a flicker of recognition, followed by a surge of unease. He remembered her now vaguely. She had been a patient several years ago, struggling with severe PTSD after witnessing a violent crime. He had recommended her for the experimental treatment, believing it might help her recover. But something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. James's hands trembled as he scrolled through the file, searching for more information. There wasn't much, just a brief mention that she had dropped out of the program unexpectedly. No explanation, no follow-up. It was as if she had simply vanished. And then he saw it. A note buried in the margins of one of the documents. A single sentence scrawled in handwriting he didn't recognize. Subject deceased, cause unknown. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Emily was dead. And somehow he felt responsible. Determined to learn more, James tracked down Emily's sister, Lily Carter. Finding her wasn't easy. She had changed her last name and moved out of state after Emily's death. But eventually, he managed to locate her through an old contact at the lab. Their meeting took place in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Lily arrived 15 minutes late, her expression guarded as she slid into the booth across from him. She was younger than he expected, with sharp features and piercing green eyes that seemed to see right through him. "You're the doctor," she said flatly, her tone devoid of warmth. "The one who signed off on my sister's treatment." James nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "Yes, and I'm sorry for your loss." She snorted, crossing her arms over her chest. "Sorry doesn't bring her back." "I understand," he said quietly. "But I need to know what happened to her, for my own sake and for yours." Lily studied him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. Finally, she sighed and leaned back in her seat. "Fine, ask your questions, but don't expect me to hold your hand while you cry about it." Over the next hour, she told him everything. How Emily had seemed fine at first, even hopeful after starting the treatment. How she had begun hearing voices, real voices, according to her diary, and how those voices had driven her to paranoia and panic. And then, one night, she had disappeared. Her body was found weeks later in a nearby lake, ruled a suicide by drowning. But it wasn't a suicide, Lily said bitterly. She was terrified of water, wouldn't even take a bath without someone else in the house. Someone made her do it. James felt sick to his stomach. He had known about the risks associated with the project, but he had never imagined it could lead to something like this. To death. And now you're hearing voices too, aren't you? Lily asked suddenly, her eyes narrowing. That's why you're here. He hesitated, then nodded. Yes, and I think they're connected to what happened to Emily. She laughed humorlessly. You really don't remember, do you? What you did to her? What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice rising. I didn't do anything to her. Lily leaned forward, her expression fierce. Maybe not directly, but you were part of it, all of it. And now it's coming back to haunt you. Before he could respond, she stood and walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the growing realization that he was running out of time. That night, the voices returned stronger than ever. But this time, they weren't just accusing him. They were guiding him. Find the lab, one whispered. Uncover the truth, another urged. It's waiting for you, a third added, its tone almost seductive. James sat upright in bed, his heart racing. He knew where the old lab was. It had been abandoned after the project was shut down. But going there felt like stepping into a nightmare. Still, he had no choice. If he wanted answers, he had to confront whatever was waiting for him. As dawn broke, he dressed quickly and slipped out of the house, careful not to wake Sarah. The drive to the lab was eerily silent, the streets deserted at such an early hour. By the time he arrived, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the crumbling building. Standing in front of the entrance, James felt a chill run down his spine. The voices in his head fell silent, as if holding their breath. He pushed open the rusted door and stepped inside, the air thick with dust and decay. And then he heard it, a faint hum, like electricity crackling in the distance. It was coming from somewhere deep within the building. Taking a deep breath, James moved forward, each step echoing in the empty halls. Whatever awaited him here, he knew one thing for certain. The past was never truly buried. Sometimes, it just waited for the right moment to resurface. The lab was exactly as James remembered it, or rather, how he didn't want to remember it. The once pristine corridors were now coated in layers of dust and grime, the fluorescent lights flickering sporadically like dying fireflies. The hum grew louder as he moved deeper into the building, pulling him forward like an invisible thread tied to his chest. He reached the main research room, its heavy steel door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, he froze. The equipment was still there, racks of monitors, tangled wires snaking across the floor, and in the center of it all, a single neural implant chair. It looked almost ceremonial, bathed in the pale light filtering through cracked blinds. But something else caught his eye. On one of the desks lay a stack of files, neatly arranged despite the chaos around them. As he approached, his breath hitched. The top file bore a name that sent a cold shiver down his spine. Dr. James Cross, subject 127. His hands trembled as he opened the file. Inside were pages of notes, diagrams, and photographs, all documenting his involvement in the project. But it wasn't just his role as a researcher. It was evidence that he had been part of the experiments himself. He had been a test subject. Memories began to surface, fragmented and disjointed, but undeniably real. He saw flashes of himself strapped into the chair, electrodes attached to his temples, his own voice screaming in pain. And then came the faces, dozens of them, staring at him with accusatory eyes. Patients he had treated, colleagues he had worked with, people whose lives he had touched and broken. "No," he whispered, clutching the file so tightly his knuckles turned white. "This can't be real." "It is," a voice said behind him. James spun around, heart pounding. Standing in the doorway was Lily, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. "You followed me," he said, his voice tinged with both relief and frustration. "I told you, I'm not letting you face this alone," she replied sharply. Her gaze shifted to the file in his hands. "So, what did you find?" He hesitated, then handed her the documents. As she flipped through the pages, her jaw tightened. "You were part of the experiment," she said finally, her tone flat. "Did you know about this?" I don't think so," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But these memories, they're coming back. Pieces of them, anyway. I remember being in the chair. I remember the pain." Lily's eyes narrowed. "And what about Emily? Do you remember her?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He closed his eyes, trying to focus. Slowly, images began to form, Emily sitting in the chair, terrified but trusting him. Him reassuring her, telling her it would help. And then nothing, just darkness. "I recommended her for the treatment," he said quietly. "I thought it would save her." Instead, his voice broke and he turned away, unable to meet Lily's gaze. She sighed, setting the file down on the desk. "Look, I get it, you feel guilty. But guilt isn't going to fix this. We need answers. Who's behind this? Why are you hearing voices now?" Before he could respond, the hum in the room intensified, growing into a deafening buzz. The monitors flickered to life, displaying lines of code scrolling across their screens. A robotic voice echoed through the speakers. "Welcome back, Dr. Cross." James staggered backward, his pulse racing. "What the hell is that?" "It's the system," Lily said grimly. "It's still active." Suddenly, the lights dimmed, plunging the room into near darkness. From the shadows emerged a figure, a man in a pristine lab coat, his face obscured by the glare of the monitors. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost soothing, but laced with menace. "James, my boy," the man said, "I've been waiting for you." The man introduced himself as Dr. Victor Hale, the lead scientist behind the neural implant project, and James's former mentor. Hale had always been ambitious, bordering on obsessive, but James had never suspected the depths of his ruthlessness until now. "You don't understand what we've created here," Hale said, packing slowly. "This technology doesn't just access memories, it reshapes them. It allows us to rewrite the past, erase mistakes, create new realities. Imagine the possibilities." "It's not rewriting memories," James shot back, anger rising in his chest. "It's destroying people. Look what it did to Emily." Hale waved a dismissive hand. "Collateral damage. Every great advancement comes at a cost. Besides, you were instrumental in its development. Without you, none of this would have been possible." James recoiled, the weight of Hale's words hitting him like a sledgehammer. He had known he was involved in the project, but to hear that he had played such a crucial role in its horrors made him physically ill. And now, Hale continued, "You're experiencing the side effects firsthand. The voices, the memories, they're fragments of your suppressed guilt surfacing. Your mind is unraveling because you can't face the truth." "What truth?" James demanded, his voice shaking. "That you killed her," Hale said simply. "Not directly, perhaps, but your actions led to her death. And now, the system won't let you forget." For a moment, James couldn't breathe. The accusation felt like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He glanced at Lily, who stood silently, her expression unreadable. Did she believe him too? "No," he said finally, his voice firm despite the turmoil inside him. "If anyone's responsible, it's you. You pushed this project too far. You sacrificed innocent people for your obsession." Hale smirked, clearly amused. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong. I didn't sacrifice them, they volunteered. Just like you did. Don't you remember signing the consent forms?" James's mind raced. Consent forms. He didn't remember any such thing. But then again, how much of his memory could he trust anymore? "This ends now," Lily interrupted, stepping forward. In her hand was a small device, something James recognized as a data eraser, used to wipe experimental records. "We're shutting this place down for good." Hale's smile faltered, replaced by a cold fury. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me," she said, pressing the button. The room erupted into chaos. Alarms blared, red lights flashing as the system began to overload. Hale lunged toward Lily, but James intercepted him, tackling him to the ground. They struggled briefly before James managed to pin him down. "Go," he shouted to Lily. "Finish it." She nodded and sprinted to the main console, her fingers flying over the keys. With a final keystroke, the system shut down, plunging the room into silence. When they emerged from the lab, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Neither of them spoke as they climbed into James's car, the weight of what they'd uncovered settling heavily between them. "So what happens now?" Lily asked after a long pause. James exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel. Now I face the truth about Emily, about myself, whatever it takes. She nodded, looking out the window. Just remember, you're not alone in this. As they drove away, James felt a strange sense of clarity. The voices were still there, quieter now, but ever present. He knew they might never fully go away. But for the first time, he understood why they existed. They weren't just echoes of his past. They were reminders of the choices he needed to make moving forward. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Part 4, the final echo. The aftermath of the lab's destruction left James in a strange limbo. Physically, he was fine, bruised, and exhausted, but alive. Emotionally, however, he felt like a house built on shifting sand, its foundation crumbling beneath him. The voices had quieted again, retreating to the edges of his consciousness, but their presence lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. Lily had stayed with him for a few days after the incident, helping him piece together what they'd uncovered. Together, they compiled evidence of Hale's unethical experiments, patient records, internal memos, even audio logs detailing his obsession with perfecting the neural implant technology. It wasn't enough to bring Emily back, but it was something, a way to ensure her death hadn't been in vain. Still, justice felt hollow when weighed against guilt. Every time James closed his eyes, he saw her face, the fear in her eyes as she sat in that chair, trusting him to save her. He replayed their final session over and over in his mind, searching for some sign he'd missed, some clue that could have changed the outcome. But there was nothing, only silence where words should have been. A week later, James received a call from Detective Miller, the officer who had investigated Emily's case years ago. Apparently, someone had anonymously sent the police a flash drive containing damning evidence against Hale and his team. The detective didn't mention James by name, but his tone suggested suspicion. "I assume you've heard about Dr. Hale's arrest," Miller said during their brief phone conversation. "If you know anything else, Dr. Cross, now would be the time to come forward." James hesitated, gripping the phone tightly. Part of him wanted to confess everything, to tell the truth about his role in the project, and accept whatever consequences came next. But another part whispered that he could still do more good outside the system than within it. So instead, he simply thanked the detective and hung up. That night, as he sat alone in his study, the voices returned, not accusing this time, but questioning. "Is it enough?" one asked softly. "What will you do now?" another echoed. James leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Was it enough? Arresting Hale wouldn't undo the damage they'd caused. It wouldn't erase the lives lost or the families torn apart. And it certainly wouldn't silence the ghosts haunting his mind. But maybe it didn't have to. Maybe facing the truth wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it. The turning point came unexpectedly. One evening, while sorting through old boxes in his attic, James stumbled upon a photograph he hadn't seen in years. It was taken during his residency, a group shot of him and his colleagues celebrating the completion of a particularly challenging case. In the background stood Emily, smiling shyly, her arm linked with Lily's. They looked so hopeful, so full of life. For the first time since the accident, James allowed himself to cry not out of guilt or fear, but out of grief. He mourned for Emily, for the trust he had betrayed, for the person he used to be. And then, slowly, he began to forgive himself, not because he deserved it, but because carrying the weight of his mistakes was killing him. Weeks turned into months. With Hale behind bars and the lab dismantled, James threw himself into advocacy work, speaking out about the dangers of unchecked technological advancement in neuroscience. He partnered with organizations fighting for stricter regulations and ethical oversight, using his story, or at least parts of it, to warn others of the risks. Sarah noticed the change in him almost immediately. Gone was the man who buried himself in work, avoiding difficult conversations and emotions. In his place was someone quieter, more introspective, but also kinder, more present. She didn't ask questions, sensing that some wounds needed time to heal, but she held him closer at night, as if afraid he might slip away again. As for the voices, they never fully disappeared. Sometimes they were faint, little more than murmurs in the background. Other times, they surged back with startling clarity, forcing him to confront memories he'd rather forget. But James learned to listen not with fear, but with understanding. They weren't enemies, they were echoes of the lives he'd touched, reminders of the responsibility he carried. One rainy afternoon, James found himself standing at Emily's grave for the first time. He knelt before the simple headstone, tracing the engraved letters of her name with his fingers. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I failed you. I let you down when you needed me most. But I promise, I'll make sure your story doesn't end here." He placed a single white rose on the grave and stood, taking a deep breath. The rain soaked through his coat, chilling him to the bone, but he didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt lighter. Months later, James published a memoir titled The Memory Haunt. It detailed his journey, not just the events surrounding the neural implant project, but the personal reckoning that followed. The book became an instant bestseller, sparking widespread debate about ethics in science and the human cost of progress. In the final chapter, James wrote, "Sometimes the echoes are louder than the truth. They haunt us not because they want revenge, but because they demand acknowledgement. To silence them is to deny our humanity. To embrace them is to begin healing." Epilogue. Years passed. James retired from clinical practice, but continued lecturing and writing, dedicating his life to preventing the mistakes of his past. Sarah remained by his side, her love unwavering even in the face of his flaws. And though the voices never left him entirely, they became less frequent, softer, as if satisfied that he had finally listened. On quiet nights, when the world felt still, he would sit by the window and watch the stars, letting their light guide him forward, because sometimes the echoes aren't meant to torment us. Sometimes they're meant to remind us that we're still here and that we can choose to be better.